This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Samuel Wilkinson. He's a professor at Yale, and he has a really interesting book out that I quite enjoyed because he puts topics on the table that are not typically on the table. His book, Purpose: What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning of Our Existence. He jumps right into the deep end, science and religion, the two competitors duking it out. But if you come from that evolutionary science perspective, do you have to toss out the religious side? Or vice versa? I appreciate anyone who puts the original thoughts on the table to get us all thinking, to all have a conversation. Important topics, important perspectives. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Samuel Wilkinson. I got to tell you, in advance of this, I started digging through your work and I'm like, wow, you are in the deep end, a deep end that I like that you've gone to, but it's a little unusual for this day and age. It opens up potentially cans of worms for you that you're so openly discussing topics that it seems like in a world where one wrong word can cause somebody to go off and say someone needs to be canceled or this or that. You are jumping right into the deep end, aren't you?
I guess you could put it like that, yeah.
Yeah. I was sharing with a friend that I was going to be speaking with you and telling her about your work. She's Vietnamese living in Thailand, and her first thought was, hold on, science and religion, how does this go together? I said to her, and this is a little bit of a paraphrase, of course, of your work, but I said to her, I think he kind of sees it like the Prometheus movie. There's a godlike creature on the side of the river dumping DNA into the river, then an evolution springs from there. Is that a terrible, quick and dirty explanation of where we're going to go today?
I must admit, I've never seen the movie. I think part of this stems from, as you allude to, I'm open about my belief. I grew up in a believing environment and home. It wasn't really until medical school that I started to wrestle with the theory of evolution, and that has posed a bit of a stumbling block for a lot of people of faith. It was at that time, just in that first year of medical school, that I wrestled with it as well. And I studied and I contemplated. Even before I got into my current field of psychiatry, that's where these ideas came from. And as I've studied human nature from this other aspect of psychiatry and depression and so forth, it served to essentially reinforce what came to me at that time. I would see it as, I think some of our current notion of God, the reason that it's hard for people of science to accept it is because some people have this thought of God that, to me, seems to come from this notion of Zeus from the Greeks. He's outside of time and matter and space and wags his finger and a bolt of lightning shoots down.
That could be. It could be the situation.
Yeah, sure. I'll give you that. But I think that doesn't seem to mesh with, at least people who study science. They see laws and principles that govern the universe.
That's a great place for me to sharpen the knife a little bit. Myself, I did 12 years of Catholic school. I asked a lot of questions. I didn't get a lot of answers. I wasn't very happy about that as I went into college. Now in my 50s, I look at things a little bit differently. My father, who is a doctor, he did the Catholic school as well, probably more strenuous, more Jesuit type stuff. We'll have open conversations. He's in his 80s now. We'll have open conversations. He doesn't try to be a big faith guy in these conversations, but his retort is always quite simple, which I think causes everyone to pause for a second, which is, okay, where did it all start? Because the Big Bang is not a very good explanation for that, because it always leaves something before that. At least for any basic thinking person is going to, okay, well, what about before that? I think that's part of the problem that science and religion, the connection is, for science, you're just saying, well, hold on, this seems a little more theoretical, a little more hypothetical. We don't know for sure. You can see right off the bat, you've got someone asking questions to you who's also wrestling.
Yeah, those are some interesting points. I don't know how much I can speak to the Big Bang. There are certain questions that, at least in our current framework, don't seem to be answerable by the scientific method. There's a quote that I like that has helped as I've tried to frame my thinking in this from a Nobel laureate named Charles Towns, who says, essentially, he says, science tries to understand what our universe is like and how it works, including us as humans. Religion is aimed at understanding the purpose and meaning of our universe, including our own lives. If the universe has a purpose or meaning, this must be reflected in its structure and functioning, and hence in science, close quote. That to me is how I've tried to frame my thinking in this. And it comes out in this book that will be coming out soon about how evolution and human nature, from my perspective at least, imply that there is an overall purpose to our existence.
Let me take it back to my Prometheus example, even though you've not seen the film. And frankly, the film did not do much for me, except the opening scene, which I thought was kind of interesting, which seems like a little bit where you've gone, which is there's this godlike alien on the side of a river, and he goes into the river and seeds this river of DNA, and then you watch this evolution unfolding. Is that not a little bit the way you see evolution? You're not throwing Darwin out the window. You're just saying that it had to start somewhere and that I believe someone started it. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I guess I could say also that there seem to be higher level principles that have, biologists would use the word constrained. I feel comfortable using the word guided evolution to go in certain directions. One of the things when I first started really wrestling with this issue some 14, 15 years ago was this notion that evolution is this completely random and haphazard process. That seemed to be at odds with a sense that there is a purpose and a meaning to our existence. Those didn't seem to mesh. Some of this comes from, there's a famous biologist who has since passed away, Stephen Jay Gould. He studied and taught at Harvard. He came up with this, essentially a thought experiment, where if you could somehow rewind the tape of life, some 4 billion years, and rewatch it, that nature would have produced a very, very different result. Life as we know it, if there were life, would not be what it is today. Almost certainly there would be no humans. That's how he framed it. I think there's been a lot of work since then to suggest that that's probably not the case, that there are cases where evolution keeps producing the same thing over and over again, the same structure, the same function.
Give an example. The flying is a great example that you give.
Birds, bats, and butterflies all have wings and the capacity for flight. But their most recent common ancestor, was understood, did not have that capacity. They essentially went their separate evolutionary ways and independently all evolved wings and the capacity for flight. In a similar way, wings are structured similar. There's a membrane that spans a rigid structures that allows for the organism to manipulate the air force and so forth. That is just one of many, many examples where the same structures over and over and over again have developed independently.
But that is potentially possible, correct?
What's possible?
Even if it's not likely, or even if the percentage chance of it happening exactly like that across different species is not likely, it's still possible, right?
This phenomenon here is something that is called convergent evolution. What that means is that organisms that are not very closely related, they converge in their structure or their function or whatever it is. They develop independently the same sort of thing. And it turns out that pretty much everything has evolved more than once, every structure. Another example is eyes. A rather old reference puts the figure at that eyes have evolved independently about 40 times. Now, there are different types of eyes. The type of eyes that we have are called camera type eyes. They are remarkable structures. They have a lens that can variably focus light. They have a diaphragm that can dilate when there's low intensity of light or constrict when there's high intensity of light. They have muscles that move essentially instantaneously in concert with the other eye and in response to the gyroscope of the inner ear. These are extremely low probabilities of matter, but camera type eyes have evolved independently about a half dozen times. We share essentially almost identical structure for eyes as a squid.
We are so far away from the squid structure, it's not funny.
Correct. It's thought that we evolved these structures independently. There's a quote that I like. It capitulates this. Once it's an accident, twice a coincidence, but 3 times or more makes a pattern. Now, we're well past the number 3 here. One of these anecdotes, so Richard Dawkins would not disagree with the way that I'm framing this notion of evolution, how he would definitely bristle at the theological implications of it. But there's this anecdote that he gives in one of his books where he asked a colleague at his institution if he could think of any, quote, good ideas in biology that had evolved only once. And his friend could maybe think of a handful. Again, you get this sense that there is this higher level structure that evolution is filling out.
I think for people that are paying close attention, it's kind of like, hold on, why do we keep seeing the development in a similar way? Why is there not some entirely new novel way? Why do we keep going back to the old standards, so to speak? That's essentially what you're mapping out.
Correct. There's a lot we don't know about this yet. What it seems like is that there's only a certain number of ways that you can come up with the ways to solve nature's problems. Now, nature's problems are how to get food, how to avoid predators, how to sense the environment in which you live, and so forth. There seem to be only a handful of solutions. And as far as we know it, nature through evolution may have figured out all of them. One of the ways that I think about this, that I think can be helpful, is a metaphor that I devised about how evolution might be like a common manufacturing technique that's known as injection molding. In injection molding, you have a solid material. Very commonly these days, it's plastic, and you heat it up until it becomes liquid. When it's in its liquid form, you inject it into this preformed cavity of a mold, and it will form whatever shape of the mold. So this is how they make, say, toothbrush handles or Legos and other common everyday objects. If you could look up close during this process at the molecules of the liquid, it would look like they're just randomly moving about. When you take a step back, you see that they are filling a void. The overall process is not a random one, but is constrained by the physical outline of the mold.
Let me shift this slightly for a second as we just talk about pure evolution, which is the idea of us, the nature of meaning and purpose, which gets to the more human side, the part that starts to become a little problematic for pure evolutionary thought to explain. Here's a thought that I want to put out there for you. Are we the only known species that can, there's some ways we might not be able to answer this question. We assume we're the only one that could even have these conversations or thoughts about what you and I are having today.
That's a good question. I don't know that we know the answer to it. It certainly seems that we are the only species with such a developed form of language. There does seem to be some notion that other creatures have the sense of self-awareness. Certain creatures, primates, for instance, other primates, you'll put them in front of a mirror and they will recognize that they are looking at a reflection of themselves. But to the extent that they can contemplate these deep mysteries of the universe and so forth, I don't want to say that they can't, but I don't know of evidence that they are doing such an activity.
Let me also share another nugget with you. I remember several years ago, and there's a video on YouTube, it's called The Four Horsemen. Hitchens and Sam Harris and Dawkins and who else? The guy's name I'm forgetting anyways. There's another professor in there. I think Daniel Dennett. They make an interesting case, and it's very plausible the way they speak. I'm not going to even attempt to paraphrase it all, but it's essentially a very atheistic perspective. I think Hitchens was a brilliant guy. I love listening to Hitchens. But on the flip side, I've seen recently another video on the internet with 3 professors, one of them being David Galertner up there at Yale. They're getting a little bit more into the headspace where you're at, which is like, hold on, some of this is not making sense. And if it's not making sense, what's wrong with theorizing? What's wrong with digging in deeper? And I think that becomes where some of the battle lines get drawn, where a lot of people don't want to touch where you've gone, correct?
Yeah. One of the things that I'm trying to, I guess, push back against is this notion, as I've studied the evolution literature, from an early stage, it seems like there's this assumption that we can't have any sort of purpose. Evolution doesn't know where it's going. On some level, that may be true. But again, with the framework of this injection molding that I just gave, there may very well be an outline that the laws of nature, again, we don't quite understand how it happens and why evolution seems to have a propensity to go in some directions and not others. I don't think the framework of it being a non-random process, I think increasingly that's a consensus.
Let me throw something else out as well. And I mean, maybe I'll get canceled for throwing this out onto the table. If I make observations of humanity and I look at different people, we all come in contact with different types of people. And there's different racial groups, there's different countries, there's different ages, etc. I mean, I'm convinced that what you're saying is true, that there is this purpose. I feel like I have it. My purpose, I feel like I don't know where it comes from. I must find the truth. I have to find the truth. And I wake up every day, it's spinning in the back of my head, like, this is my purpose. This drives me. It gives me a sense of purpose. It gives me a purpose. And I love it. It makes me feel good. It makes me wake up with an adrenaline rush every day, completely engaged every day. I am convinced that a certain number of our fellow Homo sapiens absolutely never wake up with that feeling. I don't know if somebody's going to say, Mike, that's too controversial. Are you insinuating something? I'm not insinuating anything. I'm just saying that I don't necessarily think if I buy into the idea of where you're going, I'm not so sure it applies to everybody.
That's an interesting observation. I think you're right that a lot of people don't have this purpose, or at least don't think about it. This is one of the ways in which I think being a psychiatrist has informed my approach to this issue. I study depression, ways to treat it, how we can think about it in a more productive way, and so forth. There's a lot of potential reasons that someone can develop depression. One area in which I think we probably do a disservice and maybe neglect an important way that people develop depression is through a lack of meaning or purpose. Probably one of my professional heroes is a man named Viktor Frankl, who's an Austrian psychiatrist. He had the unfortunate experience of suffering through the Holocaust. He was a prisoner in the concentration camp. His immediate family did not survive. He miraculously did survive. Within a very short time period of being released, wrote a book that continues to be a bestseller called Man's Search for Meaning, developed an approach to psychotherapy that was essentially all about trying to help people discover purpose and meaning in life.
There's a part in your work, too, that just to bring people in, I jotted this down, the 5 whys, essentially, what you're really laying out. You've already brought up the convergent evolution. I want you to also talk about the competing dispositions, the notion of free will. The last 2 that I think are really interesting is the strong family relationships as being super key, but the strong family relationships being key to a good society. Now that one, my friend, depending on how that's interpreted, strong family relationships are key to good society. Now, some people are going to get up in arms about that because they're going to say, blah, 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 blah. They're going to say something. I think today, it doesn't take much of an observation to look around at modern society and see that we've got a problem. To share with you just a quick anecdote, and I'll let you comment on these 5 issues because they're terribly important to where you've gone in your work purpose. I saw a picture today of a CVS in Washington, D.C. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. Currently talking to you from Saigon, Vietnam. But I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. So there's a CVS, and the shelves are essentially empty. And they are now putting pictures of the items on the shelves. So instead of walking into a CVS like we've done our whole life and buy some toothpaste, you now see a picture of toothpaste, and then you ask somebody to get you the toothpaste. So right back to your line of a good society and your 5th point. Yeah, we're at something. We're at some kind of a point. Something seems terribly wrong. Anyways, a little bit of a tangent there, but I think you know where I'm going. Why don't you go ahead, since we've already talked about the convergent evolution, why don't you talk about those other 4 points, the competing dispositions, the free will, and we'll get into the 2 points on family, which I think are terribly important.
This notion that evolution was not random, it doesn't, in a sense, prove that there's a purpose to our existence, but it certainly brings those 2 views a little bit closer together, if you follow me there. Another important part is the way in which evolution has shaped human nature. Now, for a long time, there have been a lot of people, including very educated and intelligent people, who have bristled at the thought that evolution has in any way influenced human nature. We've been happy to view other creatures as products of evolution, but for some reason, for probably a number of reasons, we are hesitant to ascribe human nature to having any influence from evolution and this process of natural selection.
Why are we hesitant to do that?
I think part of it has to do with maybe a superficial understanding of evolution. When Darwin first detailed his theory of evolution, there's a really funny anecdote that probably isn't true, but I think is really expressive of the sentiment thought by many, of this woman who learned about the theory of evolution and said, well, let's hope it's not true, but if it is true, let's hope it doesn't become widely known. And I think part of the sentiment underlying that is that there's this notion that if evolution is true, then we are ultimately selfish. It's easy to imagine how in this fight against nature, that only the selfish, the aggressive, the hypersexual, and so on and so forth will survive.
That's obviously not been true.
Well, it's a lot more complicated than that. At least that's not exclusively true. There are lots of different ways in which different mechanisms in evolution push and pull in different directions. Humans are a lot more altruistic than would be predicted by that initial, somewhat simplistic view of evolution. Human children as young as 18 months will readily share with an adult or help an adult, even an adult who's not related to him or her, if the adult is pretending to need help from a toddler. The way that evolution has shaped us seems to have essentially pitted us against each other. A lot of people, both those who study in evolution and those who just study human nature, have noted that we are conflicted. We are pulled in different directions. And I think this is the way that evolution has left us. We have a disposition to be extraordinarily selfish. There's lots of examples. Unfortunately, it doesn't take too much mental effort to come up with cases in point where humans have behaved in terrible and selfish ways toward one another. But we also have an immense capacity to help others, to be altruistic, to be cooperative, and so on and so forth.
What is the Darwinian explanation for why that child at 18 months wants to help the adult?
There are a lot of potential mechanisms. I'm an all of the above kind of guy. I think there are lots of potential mechanisms that have resulted in us developing a sense of altruism. One is this mechanism called direct reciprocity. Another name for that might be called tit for tat. There was a famous experiment done around 1980 where these game theorists came up with this enigma of what's called the prisoner's dilemma. Some of your audience may be familiar with it. Just to summarize briefly, you have 2 criminals who are caught. They are not allowed to communicate with each other, and they are given the chance to either cooperate, meaning not with the authorities, but with each other, or to defect and rat out the other. Now, if they both choose to cooperate, they both get a little punishment, say a year in prison. If one defects and the other cooperates, the one who defects gets off scot-free. The cooperator has to serve 3 years in prison and so forth. Basically, it's a paradigm where it makes sense in the long term if you go through what's called an iterated pattern of prisoner's dilemma exchanges. It's in your interest to cooperate in the long term, but it's in your interest in the short term to defect and to stab your partner in the back. But that doesn't make for good long-term outcomes.
Can I keep it at the child for a second? The child doesn't necessarily have this experience.
No, but may have this psychological architecture.
Let me pull on that thread a little bit. Are you just saying point blank that that's something inherited?
Yes, there's a lot we don't know about this, but there are likely certain neural circuits that underlie behaviors that have been inherited. Again, this direct reciprocity, I think, is a potential reason for the potential for altruism. There's also this notion that we act in ways where if our behavior is observed, we are going to act in more altruistic ways, where someone who has a reputation of being someone who is helpful may be helped in times of need. It's a very brief overview of this notion of indirect reciprocity, or this hypothesis based on reputation. I think the deepest form of altruism comes from something called kin selection. Kin selection is basically the way that evolution has shaped our family relationships. The easiest way to conceptualize this is thinking about the relationship between parents and their children. In human beings, our offspring are born extremely premature. They need our help. They need the help of parents and are dependent upon parental help for the better part of 15 years. And as such, evolution has created a deep desire to be altruistic towards offspring within the parents. I think that's a very self-explanatory explanation, but I think that is probably where the deepest forms of altruism come from.
Can I sharpen the knife a little bit? And I won't go any place that will potentially get us both canceled, because everyone out there with a pulse probably realizes where I was pulling on that string a little bit more when it comes to inheriting certain traits or certain intelligence or certain behaviors. It is an interesting topic in the sense that this is something that in most academic circles, you're really not allowed to talk about anymore. You're not. You know this. We could think of the professors that have been canceled. Some of them have sounded a little bit randy, and perhaps some of them have sounded a little bit too far or something. Ultimately, the discussion, and this is what's so interesting about where you've gone, is the discussion is not really allowed if you get into too much. The way that I felt like you were framing it was a little bit like, well, okay, the child is born and we're now emulating behaviors from the parents and whatnot. And I'm thinking, well, hold on. Did that child just have something, innate?
I think pretty much every human being, I can't quote you that this percent is inherited and this percent is through culture. I don't know there's a human being alive who can give you those numbers.
It's not all culture. That's the point.
Correct. From a biological perspective, I think there are these competing dispositions. I think there's a capacity for altruism. I think there's a capacity for selfishness. Now, if there is a lot of a neglect or abuse, that framework may go out the window. Young children who have a really difficult upbringing, they don't develop in a normal way. They have difficulty making relationships. They have difficulty trusting other people. And there are lots of ways in which it's very hard for them to develop strong interpersonal skills and so forth.
The young children that might grow up with abuse should not keep learned adults from having the conversation about the natures of origin and how all this started, essentially what you've just dove into the deep end on. That sometimes gets me a little frustrated, but that's a side tangent. I'm sure everybody can read between the lines. Let me take you back to free will, though. We kind of went on a side tangent, but let me let you give your perspective on free will and why that's such an important aspect to how you see purpose.
To bring this full circle, there's this sense, this observation, we perceive that we have this freedom to choose, this free will. And this is a fascinating topic that has puzzled a lot of really brilliant minds for centuries. I think there is good evidence that we do have free will. And if you'd like to break down what I mean exactly by that, I'd be happy to do so.
The floor is yours.
Great. Just to take it with the sense that we do have free will, I think this notion that are coming into existence, the non-randomness of evolution, that's one part. Another part is that we are pulled in different directions. And then this last part that we have free will. I think when you pull these together, it implies that life is a test, that we have what some people would call good and evil inherent within us, and that part of our existence is to choose between these two natures within us. That's not to say that biology and culture and other factors don't weigh in on our decisions. certainly they do. And for some people, the test is going to be easier than other people and so forth. And presumably believing that a higher power is just and can factor in the different circumstances that play out, that will be taken into account. It certainly seems to me that the way evolution has shaped us and this notion that we can choose between different parts of our nature, to me, it seems that life is a test. Now, to get into what free will is, do we actually have it? From an academic perspective, that's a controversial topic. That's not a controversial topic from a lay perspective. The vast majority of people, you ask them, do you have free will? Can you choose? Can other people be free and responsible agents? The overwhelming answer is yes. Most people intuitively believe, even children by the age of 4 or 5, see themselves and other either children who are the same age or older as free and autonomous and responsible agents. What is free will? At least the way I define it is fairly close to what probably would be a, quote, common folk definition of free will, where we have alternative possibilities before us. I ate cereal for breakfast. I could have eaten oatmeal. I could have eaten fruit.
You didn't have to be a professor at Yale. You could be at the gas station right now. Yes.
Correct. Yes, I could have chosen another profession. My undergraduate area of study was engineering. I could have decided to pursue that rather than take a little bit of a turn into medicine.
Why does someone say that's not free will? You're outlining the layperson definition. Okay, Steel Man, the guy out there that says you're wrong, what is his argument about why there is no free will?
Well, part of it is that what I'm laying out here is this notion that the universe is not necessarily deterministic. Now, that term deterministic essentially means that everything is dictated 100% by its history. There was a famous scholar, Laplace, who theorized that if you could know the position and the momentum of every single particle in the universe, you could predict with 100% certainty the way the future was going to play out. Now, that was before the discovery of quantum mechanics and so on and so forth. Turns out the universe is fairly complicated, but that is this notion of determinism. There's a lot of people, a lot of scientists who think the universe is deterministic, behavior is deterministic. There really is no alternative possibility. You could not have chosen otherwise. Does that make sense?
I mean, I understand their argument, but it doesn't make any sense.
From my understanding, my reading of literature, even at the behavioral level, there are many paradigms in which it certainly appears that behavior is not deterministic. It may be probabilistic, even in comparatively simple creatures, nematode roundworms that are commonly used in biological experiments. You'll take the same organism, subject the organism to the same precise conditions of temperature, moisture, light, feeding and training and so forth, and it will act in different ways in the same set of circumstances. From my reading of literature, behavior is not deterministic. By the way, if you talk to a purist philosopher, he or she might say, it's impossible, given the tools of science we have, to really say 100% that the universe is deterministic or not deterministic. All we can do is observe it and say, it kind of looks deterministic or it kind of looks indeterministic. We can't get there 100%. The irony of irony, you might say that, well, you get to choose whether you believe in free will. You're never going to be able to prove it. But that's the free part. That is the part where, in order for us to have free will, you need to have alternative possibilities. I should point out that this is a little bit at odds with what the majority of philosophers believe. They believe that free will can be compatible with a deterministic universe. I've thought about that a lot and studied that a lot. It doesn't quite jive or make sense to me.
I'm looking for the Lego pieces to fit. I don't feel it.
That's what a lot of philosophers believe. That's fine if you believe that. The whole argument that I'm laying out in this book can still hold and make sense and so forth.
You can already tell if I was in assorted classes at assorted universities, I would have already been kicked out. So there you go.
The other part of free will is the will part, is this notion that our thoughts can somehow influence our behavior. Now, the argument against this from an academic perspective is that, well, our thoughts are not really causing our behavior. They're just kind of a byproduct. There's these neural gears that are turning in our brain, and any thought that you have is caused by that, as well as the action that you then proceed with. This is something called epiphenomenalism. From my understanding, there's a vast psychological literature which essentially refutes this and shows that the things that we think, the thoughts that we have, can have a very strong influence on the behaviors that we carry out.
Side question here. What do the young people today think when they're on campus and they hear someone like you talk? Because you are absolutely 100% outside of the, quote, mainstream messaging. This is not, if I happen to be at your university, okay, I could come hear you and I could learn from you and all that kind of stuff, but you're not a typical thought leader out there. What is the typical reaction of young people today when they hear you speak and you lay out some of these issues?
You'll have to invite me on in another 6 months or so to test it. In the medical school, we're somewhat isolated from a lot of the undergraduates and so forth.
You've not really laid all this out yet. They might tell you to go home at some point in time.
We'll see. We'll see.
One more side point, too. I don't know if you've read it. You've read way more than I have. You brought up the word in the context of good and evil, and evil always strikes me. And one of the things that I read, I believe he was a psychiatrist, psychologist, maybe not, author, very well-selling author, Scott Peck, and The People That Lie, his writing about trying to understand evil. I've thought about this, too, a lot in the sense of like, is it inherent? Is it something they learned? I tell you, I feel like I've met a handful, a very small number of people where you see it, and my feeling is, get away. It's kind of like, okay, little kid, hand on stove, you learn. I think I've seen it 2 or 3 times in my life, the way Peck talks about this. Maybe it's just a narcissistic personality disorder, I think might be how he defines it, essentially evil. And I just, man, I don't know if other people have had that experience. I know this is a side tangent. You might not even want to comment. You might want to take me back to family here in a second. The floor is yours.
I don't know Peck's work. I know he has written about this notion of evil, and I think you're probably right that he uses the clinical terms of narcissism or malignant narcissism. It's certainly an important issue to try and understand, with the hopes that if we can understand it a little bit better, we can help people not to go down that path if that's possible.
Yeah, I think you knew where I was going. I was essentially saying my gut tells me they were on that path. They started on that path. They didn't go down that path. Let me take you to family. Your last 2 areas about really bringing us back to purpose and connecting the science and the religion, so to speak. This idea, and I'm sure if you just laid it out like I'm going to lay it out right now, there'd be plenty of people around the planet that would bark, they would whine, they would complain. They'd say, what about the people that are not part of that structure? Well, what about the people that are not a part of the family structures? Well, it's pretty easy to look at statistics. We're not blind. We can see that strong families help kids, for starters. I mean, this is all basic stuff. Somebody say, well, hold on. What about 1,000 years ago? Come on. We're not 1,000 years ago. We're right now today. And we know that families are a huge part of human success and human happiness. It's amazing that we even have to have arguments about it. And look, the last 6, 7 years, my home country has become quite alternative. There are all kinds of new directions. That's all great and well, but it seems like the tried and true, when it come back down to the word family, has got a lot of evidence behind it for really good things.
Yeah, what I'm trying to do is connect it a little bit with evolution. As we've talked about here, I think the strongest form of love and altruism and cooperation comes from the way that evolution shaped family relationships. The biological term for this is kin selection. Parents have a deep love and a deep sense of altruism to care for their children. I think part of what it comes down to is helping men be connected with the rearing of their children and the importance of fatherhood. I think the vast majority of social scientists, people who are trying to form policy and so forth, would agree to that. I think there's a disagreement as to how best to help that move forward. There's a biological aspect to this because the way that evolution has shaped us leaves an imbalance in the strength of the tie of relationships between men and women and their children. Women carry the children. They have a 9-month gestational period where they carry the unborn child. They historically nurse the child for sometimes a year or more after birth. There's a very tight biological connection, an emotional bond that forms. For men, it's a different picture. Man has a relatively small biological contribution to the conception of a new child. His link to the rearing of offspring can be somewhat tenuous. This is where it's important to try to come up with strong cultural ways to tie men to their children.
Of course, in plenty of cases across cultures, countries, etc., it's not been so tenuous. We definitely have different groups, different races, etc., different personalities, different ages, different whatever, but there are plenty of men where it's not been tenuous. Fair assessment?
Correct. And I think that's where the culture comes in. When you look at humans and you compare them to, biologists will classify as primates, some other primates, the males in those groups are very invested in rearing their offspring. In other groups of primates, they are essentially not invested at all in rearing the offspring. We are somewhere in the middle. We are a species where men can and certainly seem to have a capacity to be very involved. And then there's another aspect to that where men can be wandering parents and so forth. And by the way, these are just very general and broad strokes. There's obviously lots of exceptions and so forth. Overall, I think if we can help men be tied more to the rearing of their children, that's going to be good for the men. It's going to be good for the children. I think that's going to be good for society, because I think where the strongest forms of the better aspects of their nature, our nature, come from is through kin selection. And so when we are embedded in family relationships, those family relationships are strengthened. Men are involved in rearing their children. Their better natures tend to predominate.
Just to throw out some of the modern controversy, I'm fond of saying on this podcast, I theorize where the number came from, but New York City has 31 legally recognized genders. You look at something like purpose. I look at the direction where you're going. Maybe there's 31 genders in this world. Maybe there's 2 sexes in this world. Maybe there's 8 billion different genders. I mean, a lot of people say, hey, I'm not even sure I'm buying into the word gender. All kinds of debates here. But it does seem like when things start to get more complicated in this area, it gets harder and harder to get back to this notion of purpose. Even just the basics of family. If we just stick with the way we all came along, the whole men and women type thing until the last 5 or 6 years, that was what we knew. It does seem like this becomes now a generational conversation too, because here you and I are having this conversation. And what might a 16 or a 17 or 18-year-old think if they hear this conversation? They might say, well, gosh, these 2 men are talking about families and a man and a woman, and I see things completely different, and I'm right there with New York City. It seems like we've created a lot of roadblocks and obstacles to purpose in the last handful of years.
That's an interesting observation. I think what I'm trying to say here, I'm not saying that as a society we should be forcing people into one situation or another. I don't think that's a society where you or I want to live. Some of the recent data on fertility and also desired fertility. So you ask women, how many children do you want to have? And the answer in a recent survey, I think that I read it from the Institute of Family Studies, was about 2.7. The actual number of children that they have is 1.8. So almost by a whole child, women are having fewer children than they would like. I think there's enough innate and intrinsic desire to form families. I don't think we're going to have to force people into one group or category or another, but I do think it's important to discuss. It is tricky. I think we have to be respectful of difficult circumstances and varying circumstances where some people come from. One of the things you mentioned is that this is a tricky topic because life's not fair. Some people come from difficult circumstances, relationships. Their parents are not particularly good, or maybe there was abuse and so forth. And that's terrible. And that's tragic. And there need to be ways to try to remedy those exceptions. But I think overall, what evolution would suggest that by and large, all else being equal, parents have their children's best interest at heart. I think that's a function of evolution, whether it's conscious or not. Parents seeing their children a perpetuation of their genes, of their offspring. I think again, there are going to be lots of exceptions. We need to make room for those exceptions. But I think if we try to structure it in a way in which it's easy to choose to form families, that a lot of people will naturally want to do so. I think it's built into them evolutionarily.
You talk about that a strong family is the key to a good society. And I've brought up some issues in this conversation and hinted about stuff and this and that. And I'm curious to hear from you, what is the definition of a good society? I shall add to start, and before you answer it, I had a chance to spend most of my life, let's say about 80% of it, in the States, in America. And then I've had a chance to spend the last 11 or so odd years in Asia. One of the things that we talk about, we meaning several American friends that happen to be in the same area that I'm at, we often have conversations about tradition and traditional cultures. And overall, one of the observations that we end up making in this part of the world is the traditional culture attracts us compared to maybe it was the same when we were kids. Maybe America had more of that tradition, but that America is losing some of that tradition. At least it's just my perspective, friends' perspectives. I'm going to give you the floor. But I would love for you to comment on the notion of a good society, because I feel like there are many different societies and many different cultures across this planet. They're not all going in the same direction. They might not all be good. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you, Michael. I think you're right. It's tricky to come up with a precise definition of what a good society is. I think most of us have at least a vague sense of what it would look like. It would protect the vulnerable. It would value principles of truth and justice. It would afford opportunities for individuals to obtain happiness. I think a lot of this political controversy that exists these days is people can't agree on how best to order these principles, which one is more important and so forth. That's part of the polarization. I don't think that's all the polarization of politics these days. I think much of this debate overlooks another fundamental problem that prevents us from building a good society, which is that the darker propensities of our nature, selfishness, greed, aggression, dishonesty, and so forth, are at odds with communal well-being. I think we would all agree, or virtually everyone would agree, if there were a way to make people more virtuous, to make them more altruistic, then building a good society, even if we don't agree on the precise definition of what that means, would be easier. Again, what I'm trying to argue is based on the way that evolution has shaped us, if we help men in particular be more tied to the rearing of their children, their better natures will predominate. And whether it's a Western society or an Eastern society and the different flavors that those societies have gone, it will be easier.
I want to push back on one thing. You've addressed several times men, essentially wayward fathers, not sticking around, all that kind of stuff. I do think that there exists in some cultures, I'm not naming names, in some cultures, not all women are playing as June Cleaver, so to speak. It's not Leave It to Beaver. It's not sweet little grandmas. There are some ladies out there that are playing a different ball game. There's plenty of men these days who feel like, look at the voting patterns of America. If a typical presidential election was held, all women voted, it would always be the blue winner. The typical presidential election was held and men were voting, it would always be the red winners. There's quite a divide between the two. And I don't necessarily want to leave the audience thinking that men are just all cats out on the run. And ladies play a role too. And they're making decisions. And I think a lot of decisions that modern women are making today have confused the hell out of men. And look, men are quite simple in many ways. Maybe that's good or bad. I mean, it's like eat, sex, build a house, take care of family. I mean, work. I mean, it's not as complicated maybe sometimes as the conversation with the ladies. How do you see that?
This may be one of the ways in which I've erred, and not to bring this into the conversation more. One of the reasons I keep going back to men is because at least our most severe social problems, crime, violence, and so forth, tend to be problems of male aggression that is a little bit out of control, not a little bit, but out of control. If we can somehow reduce those, and I think there's a lot of evidence from sociology suggesting that when men are tied to the rearing of their children, their aggressive impulses are redirected into pro-social forms. From an interesting biological perspective, there's a strong notion in public mind that testosterone is one of the problems, and high testosterone equals high violence and aggression and so forth. It's really complicated. On a first order approximation, there's some truth to that.
Women seem to love the testosterone, though. Let's be frank here.
It's dependent. It's context dependent. It's context dependent. So much of this biology is context dependent. But when men have a child as a new father, their testosterone levels plummet if they are involved in the rearing of their children. It seems like in a very real and biological and evolutionary way, when men are engaged in the rearing of their children, their aggressive impulses are directed in pro-social ways. And I think generally that's a good thing for the species, for the human race.
I have just scratched the surface with you today. We could really go, and we should do this again in the future if you're game. I enjoy this. It's very philosophical, a little bit different than I typically do on this podcast. And you are very wise to many different sources and issues. So it's fun to throw at you and see how you bounce things back. So it's quite enjoyable. The book, Purpose, What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning of Our Existence. Again, we've only scratched the surface today. You get into a lot of detail, and I implore people to check out where you've gone. If not for anything, it's just to dive into perhaps a different perspective, to get people thinking. Got me thinking. I appreciate that. Hey, where can we send people? The book, Amazon, all that kind of fun stuff. Is there a website or a place you would like to direct people to come find you if they want to find you?
There is a website, samueltwilkinson.com.
Cool. Samuel, I hope you enjoyed today. I kind of bounced you around, but again, you're a good sport. It's an important conversation. We're not going to necessarily ever know all. I like the idea that you're putting it out on the table and you're trying to have a different conversation, because there's so much of modern talk today that just feels like talking points written in a newsroom. So props to you for doing your own thing.
Well, Michael, I appreciate you having me on the show. Thanks so much.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.